So here's an example of using some probably Illustrator graphics, the cookies here, some text on an Illustrator, a photograph. So this is a photograph of Ben and Jerry in a this isn't really a poster, it's more of a sculptural element, but this poster here, or this graphic and image, were put together and then printed very large. And so when you're creating something like this, you're probably using two programs. You might be using Illustrator to lay out the text and the illustrations, and then Photoshop to bring in the photograph. And really the difference between those two programs is that Illustrator, where you're going to lay out the graphics and the text, or the illustrations and the text, is resolution independent. So you don't need to think about what size you're going to print it as. But when you work in Photoshop, which is dependent on these little dots of color called pixels, so photographs are made up with all these little tiny color dots. It's very resolution dependent. So if you work in Photoshop, you really have to think about what size you're going to print. What's the biggest possible size you would print at? And then you have to use that resolution, that appropriate resolution, or your images won't look very good. They'll look kind of blurry and soft. You've all seen probably bad web images. So it's important to think about, and once we start working with the softwares, or once you start working with the softwares, you'll see how important it is to really consider that resolution. And print resolution is 300 ppi. Web resolution, which is if you're just designing for a website, for example, is less. It's about 72 ppi. So here's the Ben and Jerry's tickets. Everyone gets a ticket when they're waiting for something, and you can see the beautiful, kind of fun, playful graphics, the type, everything. It's just down to the very last detail is thought about, considered, and designed. Here are the t-shirts. Perfect for folding them. You see that the Ben and Jerry's logo is right there as they fold over. And here's some of the brochures, front and back. So when you design a brochure, you're always thinking about the different sides and how they flow together. And here's the graveyard. Some of these flavors didn't make it, unfortunately. So Rainforest Chunk, Strawberry Cheesecake, all rest here. Packaging, another really important area of graphic design. So we're going to look at, this is a one color print job. So just black was used. Black, gray, and white is just one color. And sometimes you would choose to do this because of budget. So to print with just in grayscale is significantly less than to print in color. Other reasons might be this is a very sophisticated product and you want to keep that kind of sophistication that goes along with gray and black. And this was just I thought this was a beautiful product. Here's an example of a CD design, so you can kind of see the identity and the visual tie between the case, the inside flap here, the CD itself, and how everything is kind of put together and considered and all flows together very nicely visually. It's also just a one color job. So when you go to a commercial printer, you can either print something in CMYK, which is cyan, yellow, magenta, and black, or you can choose a specific spot color that's really just a pre-mixed color that would be added into black ink. And a spot color is often cheaper than getting a CMYK full color job. So that's a consideration. Also, using just one color, a monochromatic design and print, is very sophisticated. So when we start getting into color theory and we look at different color families, color relationships, color schemes, you'll see the advantages of monochromatic color schemes, complementary color schemes, which are colors opposite each other on the color wheel, and how they communicate when you're using them in design. So Boneyard pencils, a good example of really considering audience. So this design was done with a kind of teenage boy, kind of grungy audience in mind. So obviously students, it's very playful, but in kind of a, grunge, older kid way. I think my 10-year-old would really like these. So thinking about that audience is critical, and often before you start a design job, you meet with the client. You first discuss the output, what it's going to be exactly. You discuss the product and the intent of the product and who the product is marketed towards. And who it's marketed towards becomes your target audience in the design process. So another example, this is an internet appliance, and they chose to kind of use this really retro 1950s look in their design style guide, and they use these graphics such as the blender, and it really was quite playful. It was much more for a young professional audience, and they used these kind of soft blues but also these complementary yellows to kind of make it pop out. Boxed water is better for the earth. This is really a typographic design. Sometimes, well, there are some graphics here. You can see these symbols on the back, but sometimes a typographic design is very appropriate and can be extremely powerful. And I think the contrast between the white and the black here, you do have these little graphics. The text is laid out very precisely on the back here. Here's some wine labels. You can see these are all monochromatic, and they're kind of very retro, using these old kind of, it reminds me of old Hitchcock movie posters here. And it's Killinbibin, something like that. But very playful, very fun. And you can see the actual shape of the label and how they kind of customized it a little bit. And it's not just a generic rectangular shape. Posters. When you design something as a poster, there's a few things to consider. But first, let's look at typography. So typography comes from these metal type terms, or this old process that was used, and it was a hand letterpress where they would take these letters out of drawers, and they would sometimes be made of metal, sometimes be made of wood, and they would tighten them together. You can kind of see they put them together, and they use these little spacers if they want to add more space between them, but they kind of push them all together. And then they lay them flat, and they kind of pull, they tighten it all up, they put the ink in, and they kind of pull it through, and it creates this print. So that's kind of what they used to do before computers. And you can see these are examples of all the different letters. When we talk about leading, that means they used to put these pieces of lead between the letters themselves to kind of give more space. And so that's where that term in typography, leading, came from. Space between lines. It's actually these lead plates they used to use to space the letters. So you can see the press where they kind of laid it out. Sometimes it's still used. It's kind of a more fine art practice to use these hand letterpresses now, but it's actually really cool when you see how they lay it all out. You can kind of see them here. They've all been tightened up. The ink is being applied. They're going to pull the paper through, and then they create this poster here. And it does give it a kind of an interesting aesthetic. It's kind of like printmaking, where you see a print made by a printmaker. It's always beautiful. It's always original. So starting in the 1870s in Paris, posters became kind of the dominant means of mass communication. So here's a poster for Moulin Rouge, and this was designed by Henri Toulouse-Lautrec, and he was a famous artist slash designer at the time, and he designed a lot of these posters. And this was kind of the primary means of advertising back then. And when we talk about poster design later on in the course, we'll kind of talk more about posters. But these were very fun. They were often put up on the sides of buildings to advertise nightclubs, other venues. And this is kind of the first time in history, or really the first time in history, in these large cities where graphic design started to become a means of communication. Before it was just, announcements occasionally plastered on buildings, but design became kind of the infancy of design started during this time period. Here's the Oneida Biscuit Boy, very early design, and you can see the original image, the inspiration, the illustration that was created, and the signage. And this was in 1890. Coca Wine. Before Coca-Cola, there was Coca Wine. And you can see how graphic design back then was kind of, it was all over the place. So I see this huge space between coca and wine here, and I would just tighten that up myself if I were redesigning this poster. But it was kind of, designers, there was no school of thought when it came to design, and design was pretty irregular. People were just doing what they did, kind of based on their intuition. Okay, here's Coca-Cola a little bit later on, going into 1899, 1901, and you can see how this company really, did think about the visual connection, and they really started to market their product very early in the company's history, and because of that, they became this huge empire. Another example of a poster design, and you can see Art Nouveau is something we're going to talk about. It's a visual style that we'll actually study, or a visual design movement, and in this movement, we'll talk about it more later, they used a lot of very organic shapes, often women, these very beautiful organic women with long hair and organic shapes. We'll also look at some specific art movements like Italian Futurism. And this was kind of a new art forged out of the beauty and speed. It kind of glorified war and rejected fine art that had come before. And it was really responding to a lot of things that were going on in the world during that time. So when we start talking about these movements, Italian Futurism being more of an art movement, and Art Nouveau being more of a design movement, you'll see that these movements were inspired and created and born out of political issues. And the world really was, transformed in the early 1900s. And we have seen in the last 150 years huge amounts of change. This is a poster design. I put this in here just to kind of show, some things about what to consider with poster design. So there's always kind of a visual typographic hierarchy to consider when you're designing a poster. Often they're seen from far away, so you want to have the text that's pretty critical to read, probably larger or in a key place within the visual space. And then there's always other information that you need to include, and somehow you kind of decide what needs to be, sometimes in discussion with the client, what needs to be read first, second, and third. This is obviously an example of a collage, so there is a graphic that was used, probably created in Illustrator, and then they have this kind of image of these eyes here. This is a photo collage, so this was probably done in Photoshop and then maybe brought into Illustrator. AIGA is a design organization, and it's a really good place to go. So if you go to the AIGA website, you'll see a lot of influential designers, great poster design, and it's just a good place to kind of be inspired, especially when you start working on your own designs for your posters. Sometimes design is very conceptual, so this was a brilliant campaign for illiteracy. There's nothing quite as rewarding as hearing an adult read for the very first time. So just text, but it's really getting across the importance of literacy, and it's doing it in a very simple way.